Thank you guys for coming so much. I love Gatlinburg. I've been back several times this year, and we did a conference with the VRHP a few years ago, and I think most of you guys were here for that. So thank you for coming back. Thank you for engaging with the magazine and helping us through that. How many of you have been in this industry for over 5 years? Whoa, that's not intimidating at all. How many of you have been in the industry for over 10 years? Over 20? Okay, wow. I kind of suspected that, and Amber and I actually, she's sitting up here talking about it. We were talking about kind of the agenda going into this, and we were thinking that we can't dumb this down. Like, these people already know a whole lot. So I've really worked hard to put together an agenda and presenters who have been in the industry for a long time, who do understand it, who are not fresh faces, except for our revenue management guys. These guys are fairly new. But so I hope that you'll find the content engaging. One of the things we're starting with first thing in the morning is data. And I know that's not typical at a conference like this, but we did this in Destin. It was super interesting to look at how vacation rentals are performing across markets. So what we're looking at right now is a lot of the central mountain markets like Blue Ridge, obviously Gatlinburg, Asheville, and then we've got some people here from the coast as well. So we're gonna pick up some of that North Carolina and South Carolina data as well. So I'm going to introduce to you Jason Sprinkle. He's the CEO of, I think you're the CEO now. Did you promote yourself? Of Key Data. And how many of you are using Key Data? Have you bought into this? So Key Data provides source data in the vacation rental industry. And what I mean by source data is that it's coming directly from your property management system. So when everyone can contribute to this, the better we can become as an industry. So I can't urge you enough to sign into that. I'm also going to bring up Sarah Frenzen from Natural Retreats. She's the smartest actual boots on the ground revenue manager I know, way smarter than me. So she's going to challenge some of this data as he brings it up and ask him some questions. But I'm going to grab a mic and I'm going to hit the audience. So if you have questions, raise your hand. And I'll bring it to you. And you don't have to wait till the end. Just raise your hand at any point. So Jason, Sarah, thank you so much.
All right, good morning, everybody. Appreciate you guys having us here this morning. Excited to be back in Gatlinburg. I think the last time I was up here is at the last show with Amy. And always a pleasure to be with this group. As Amy said, her shows tend to bring in the best and the brightest. We had a great show down in Panama City or in Sandestin a few weeks ago and ran through some really interesting data there and thought it'd be a good idea to come up here and kind of start the show off with just a look at what's happening in your market. So when you go to dig in this afternoon across some of the other presentations, you can have a sense of what the year looked like last year and more importantly what this year looks like coming up and where some of the kind of the hot spots are that you might need to look out for. In terms of data, one, it's not that sexy. That's why we bring Rob Johnson to the shows to fill that role. And it's a little dry to start out in the morning, so bear with me. We're going to try to make it as digestible as possible. There are some interesting things, in putting these presentations together. Quite honestly, I always look for a market that's just exploding or a car crash. And I say that with all due respect to those of you who are in the industry like me. I want the car crash to have happened in the past, and then there'd be a great recovery that we can show. But we want something dramatic in the data. And we really saw that down in Panama City when we went through the data set down there. Panama City had the hurricane, and there were a lot of markets that were deeply affected by that. I know you guys had the fires up here and went through kind of some tumultuous times with that. The good news as we start off is everything's pretty level. I'll skip to the end. There are no car crashes, thank goodness. There's no markets at the same time that are really exploding and changing the world dynamically. But there are some interesting trends that I think will be helpful for y'all to spot and kind of walk through. So first thing I want to do, we're going to be talking about a lot of geography and a lot of data this morning for just a little bit. So I want to give you some definitions and just make sure you understand the source of our data so you know what you're looking at and perhaps more importantly what you're not. So we get our data from two sources. One, we get OTA supply data. We get that from scraping Airbnb and scraping VRBO. We do that just for the United States. So we scrape basically every listing off either one of those sites. We match them or dedupe them, whatever the case may be, and that helps us give a sense of what's happening in your market in terms of total supply, and then we break that down by bedrooms and what the split is in the listings between Airbnb or VRBO, so we can see which markets are dominant on which listing site. And then secondly, our primary goals. We go out there and we have effectively what Amy sometimes refers to as a co-op, which is where we work with your data. We plug into pretty much every property management system out there, and then we get data. I was glad to see so many hands. The data that you'll see up here today for almost every chart is the data that's coming from the people in the room and the businesses that work in your local areas. So if you're not participating, would love you to. The goal here is to get better and better data for the industry. So let's start with some areas first so that we're working. When you see data for an area, you know what area we're talking about. So we'll take this whole region here, and we'll define that as Southern Appalachian Mountains, and that runs from Blue Ridge all the way up to Boone, all the way up to the Virginia border. We're talking about the entirety of almost 43,000 units. So when you see data talking about the entire Southern Appalachian Mountain Range, that's what we're talking about. Mostly 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. No surprises for those of you that are in these markets. We've got primarily houses, although there are some condos, and then a whole lot of fireplaces. That's what stands out when you look at your data compared to everybody else. And I assume hot tubs as well. And then we've got subregions. And so, these are buckets that are, what drive our data. They're familiar to you, but everybody, it seems like these days, draws a little bit of different lines. So when you're looking at a market and we're talking about whether it's up or down, these are the 4 markets primarily that we're going to go over. And then we'll hit the North Carolina coast and South Carolina coast. So really 6 markets worth of data that we're talking about, and then the area as a whole. So most of the time we're working left to right. North Georgia down at the bottom, Tennessee Smokies, Western North Carolina, and Northwest North Carolina. For purposes of going through this, can you guys help me out? Who do we have here that falls into the North Georgia bucket? All right, just a few. How about the Tennessee Smokies? A lot more. And Western North Carolina? All right, you guys have the most interesting data, so some things to watch out for as we go through it with you guys. And then Northwest North Carolina? Just a handful. Okay, most in the Smokies as we'd expect. All right, let's go through these and just tell you at a real high level the areas, kind of what's happening in them from a definition standpoint, and then we'll jump into the data quickly. So this North Georgia market, just on the OTAs, represents about 6,200 units as of this morning. It's mostly 3 bedrooms. You can see down in the bottom left, the distribution is mostly 2 and 3 bedrooms. Houses versus condos, about 95% houses, okay? Probably no surprise there. It's slightly a VRBO market compared to an Airbnb market. Some are pretty significantly more one than the other. This one's almost even. And then if you look at when you do your bookings in the top right corner, the next few slides will all be the same setup. That's the calendar year by month, left to right, so January to December. And for those of you in the market, no surprise, but this is a real busy month for you. March, very busy. It looks like the guest bookings when they arrive is the chart below. So it looks like you do an awful lot of bookings in March for the summer, and then you stay busy through the fall. All right. Tennessee Smokies, where we're at. A lot of 2 bedrooms, way prevalent compared to the rest of them. More condos here than the last market, so 15%. And we will, as is always with Amy's shows, we'll send all these slides out. So if any of this data grabs you by the ears and you want it, it'll be emailed out to you shortly. Busiest time right now for bookings, by far your peak month. So your reservations team could slow down here in the next 2 months, but super busy right this second. And then, as with the rest of these markets, what looks like the stock market the last couple of days, it's just up and down and up and down and up and down, right? Or I guess it's been a lot more down, but a pretty volatile occupancy curve compared to what we see around the country, which fast forward a couple of slides, it makes rates pretty tough for you guys. I think you probably have one of the toughest markets when it comes to trying to get revenue management right, so I empathize deeply with you. But a lot of bookings going on right now for sure, and then again, even a heavier VRBO market for the Smokies. All right, Western North Carolina, Murphy up to Asheville. One with a little bit more activity that we'll talk about it, one that acts a little bit different than the other markets, okay? More 1 bedrooms than anything else by just a hair. About 13% condos, and it's our only market that we're going to talk about today that has more listings on Airbnb. And my guess is, you guys know this market better than I do, but my guess is that's reflective of Asheville and a more urban market, and I assume that's why it's driving more Airbnbs. but definitely the only market that favored Airbnb, and Airbnb by a pretty good shot. Not overly busy in bookings right now. Looks like you guys peak in May, and then it is a pretty solid off season for you guys at the end of the year, but just as volatile when it comes to occupancy in terms of when your guests come in. An awful lot of rate periods there for you guys to deal with in terms of setting pricing. And then last but not least, Northwest North Carolina, about 5,300s in total there. Mostly 2 bedrooms, a lot more condos in this market. Back to a Verbo market. When you book, you're in a relatively slow part of the season right now, and most of the bookings are happening there, as you see in August, the latest peak in terms of bookings of all the markets we looked at. And then what looks kind of like a summer and peak holiday break market from a guest standpoint, but certainly a more volatile market than what we see around the rest of the country still. And
Jason?
Yep. You bet.
The bookings and the guests, are those both from scrape data as well?
Those are not. That's a great, fair question. So those are both from our real data set. So other than the data that you see on the left there, everything else you'll see today will be from, is it the double mic?
Yeah. No, the question was the 2 visuals on the right side, the bookings and the guests, were they scraped or was that from the PMS data that was coming in? And he was saying it was from the actual PMSs, aggregated.
Yeah, and I should clarify that as we go along. Basically, other than the supply stuff that you see on the left-hand side, everything from us today will be from the real data. All the metrics on the ADR and occupancy and RevPAR, everything's pure real data. In terms of key data's evolution, we are this month finalizing what we call KPIs for the OTA data, but that's not out. That's not included in any of this. And I do want to make it a part as a company to always distinguish what we're showing you guys. So thanks for pointing that out, sir. All right, South Carolina coast. Amy said we've got some folks here from South Carolina. Show of hands. All right, good. Run the whole coast here. We're just doing North Carolina coast versus South Carolina as a whole. You see some bigger houses, obviously along the coast, but still principally 2 bedrooms, heavier condos, more condos than houses. No surprise there probably with the Myrtle Beach market. And then, roughly 40,000, just under 40,000 total properties showing up on the OTAs. And, as a reminder, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how many units are out in space. There's not a direct correlation that can give you an exact count now. We've got a lot of markets where we've got almost 100% saturation, and so we have more real markets or real properties feeding us data than what we find on the OTA sometimes. So it just depends on the market and the amount of the inventory that's out there. But in terms of the inventory that's out there, just under 40,000 units. And then this is a heavy VRBO market, much more than the previous 4 markets that we looked at. And then lastly, North Carolina coast. Who's here from North Carolina? Taking up the back, all right. North Carolina, they've got the big houses, right? The inventory that we all want to have, all the nice big 6, 7 bedrooms that do several $100,000 a year. Massive houses compared to condo market. Way more VRBO than Airbnb, really the smallest Airbnb market as a whole. Only have 19,000 properties out there. My sense from talking to the people in the market is that there's an awful lot of properties that just aren't on the OTAs in that market. So probably not representative of the full supply out there. We do have very good penetration in this market, just about all the big players, and so the real data I feel great about, but gives you a sense of how the North Carolina coast compares. Almost entirely Verbo compared to Airbnb, or twice as many. All right, let's jump into 2019. These are the kind of slides that will put you directly to sleep, so bear with me. So all I want you to take from this slide is 2 things. One, just the volatility of it, right? That was one of the things that impressed me, and probably doesn't surprise you guys because this is where you live and breathe every morning and you try to make sense of how to price your units throughout the day. That's an awful lot going on, a lot of up and downs to try to figure out where to place your premium pricing and when to drop it and how frequently to drop it. The other thing that I want you to take away is the Tennessee Smokies and North Georgia, which are the blue and orange line. They tend to behave very similarly when you dig into the data. markets are similar in performance, both in occupancy and rates and trends. And then Western North Carolina there at the bottom tends to follow very similar patterns with Northwest North Carolina. And those are, by the way, that's what we call adjusted paid occupancy. I promised Sarah that I would try to do some definitions this morning. As these shows have evolved with Amy, we've changed the name on you guys of a lot of these metrics just to keep you guessing. But we've kind of all settled in, I think, in the market on a few names that seem to be sticking and making a little more sense. For those of you who haven't been through them with us, we use the term adjusted paid occupancy to mean occupancy with the holds and owners stays taken out, okay? So we take it out of the denominator and the denominator. So it's basically how much did you book out of how much you had available to book, right? Pull all the holds, pull all the owner stays out. And that evens out any kind of owner usage or any kind of holds that were put in there. And so we'll be talking about occupancy throughout the day. Every time I'm talking about it, you'll either see APO for adjusted paid occupancy on the site. If I just say occupancy for purposes of today's data, in most of the data that we're driving out there these days, it's always going to be adjusted paid occupancy. All right, Tennessee Smokies versus 30A. Okay, I'm from 30A. Know a lot of folks in the room. I was shocked at how much volatility, as I said, your occupancy has. And so I pulled up our occupancy just to kind of get a sense of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And it surprised me how similar the markets were. I think we pull from a lot of the same feeder markets. But it made me empathize with the people in the room because I know our teams back home have 30 plus rate categories for a year, and I thought we were very unusual, but when I look at this market now, I realize that that's something you guys are dealing with on a daily basis. And so, I put the numbers on there. There's 15 peaks, and if you think about it, there's obviously 15 corresponding troughs in the data. And so if you're trying to price your data points right, or your occupancy versus your ADR, it looks to me like you've got really 30 distinct rate opportunities, right? If you want to maximize all the peaks and maximize the opportunities in all the troughs. How many of you have 30 different rate categories across a period, across the year? Okay, how many? 15? Okay, less than 10? All right. Something to think about, right? Particularly if you're in this market, or if you looked at all those markets we looked at this morning. If you've got 10 or less rates for the whole period, it might be working out. You got to look at your data and see how you're beating your customers. But it certainly feels like from a pricing opportunity, Sarah, you do this in an awful lot of markets. Is it fair to say that just because you see that many peaks and troughs that you ought to have roughly that many different rate sets? Or
I think it depends on how you're doing your rates, right? I mean, you could start with, 10, 15 or whatnot, but if you're not, adjusting them and working with them and massaging them daily and,
That's a trick now, right?
That's really the thing, and that's probably what accounts for a lot of those peaks and valleys, is it's not just, we set those 10 levels or we set those 15 or 30 levels, but you're consistently and constantly adjusting them.
More than that, right?
Yeah,
More
yeah.
than 30.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as more we
That's
go around.
averaged.
Yeah, the more we go around the country, the more I hear a lot of these. Obviously, the technology in the room, the pricing algorithms gives you the opportunity to have more than 30 rates. You can have more than 365 rates. I heard the guys from Vacasa doing a presentation at one of the, I think it was at the Rates and Revenue show, and they're changing prices up to 4 times a day, right? And so they're looking for those inter-day trades. And so I know most people in the room aren't at that level. We don't have, teams of data analysts down in your way running these numbers for us through algorithms on a daily basis, but there's some tech in the room that allows you to do that. And so, find your happy spot, but you certainly got a lot of volatility in terms of the number of visitors you have in your market. I think it's easily fair to say you've got as much as anybody in the country. And so if you don't have a heavy use of rate changing through either a manual process or an automated process, it's something you definitely want to look into.
Hey, Jason, on these date ranges at the bottom, it's hard to see our
Okay,
spreads.
yeah. Hell, it's hard for me to see.
Are they weeks?
This is weeks, and so that's by week for the entirety of the year. I'm sorry. Yeah, so that peak in the center there, spring break is number 5, summer's 8 and 9, Thanksgiving's 14, Christmas is 15, okay? And all the slides will be an annual look, unless I tell you otherwise, but thank you, Amy. Make sense? All right, same thing by week. Adjusted paid occupancy, North Carolina coast, okay? What do you guys notice here about the volatility, right? 8 peaks. Seems to me a lot easier market to price. Again, you've got competitors in your market as well that are pricing on a daily basis, if not more frequently. But you just see an awful lot less in terms of a shift. So a little bit easier market to price for, in my opinion, when you compare that to the markets here around the Smokies. All right, we're going to jump to 3 big KPIs and walk through those for the Southern Appalachian Mountains, the whole first map I put up, the whole area. Here we're looking January to December, adjusted paid occupancy for all the Southern Appalachian Mountains, right? So you've got by month, the blue line is 2019 and the gray line is 2018. And all we're trying to see is from a performance standpoint, how did you guys do at filling the days you had available to fill for 2018 versus 2019? And if you cheat and you look at the red box where I've tried to put the end answer for these, you broke even. 2019 performed almost identical to 2018. It's scary to see the consistency across this market. You've got some differences that we'll walk through between the submarkets, but for the market as a whole, and those of you who went through it probably felt like you had a pretty consistent year between the 2 years. Very, very consistent from an occupancy perspective. From a budgeting standpoint, I would think that's best case scenario, right? You can almost look at this and look at a couple of years of consistency you have, and you can almost tell exactly what your budget's going to look like for the following year. From a rate perspective, if you set your 2019 rates based off of your 2018 performance, you probably did very, very well, right? The market responded exactly like it did the year before. You obviously had the shift in Easter there in the beginning. You see the difference between the peak the previous year. You see that in every market just about. A little bit down for the summer, but you made up for it in Labor Day. Shift obviously there for the Thanksgiving week, and then a little bit of shift in the Christmas week. This curve is a curve that we see down on our coast, and we see it in most of the markets we look at that are beach markets that have that kind of spring break, summer, off-season peak. But very, very consistency from very, very consistent from an occupancy standpoint. All right, let me take you through this slide because there's a lot of slides that look just like this. Southern Appalachians on the left, 2018 in gray, 2019 in blue. And we're looking at the year-over-year change in adjusted paid occupancy, and this is just looking at those sub-markets. We know it was the same across the entirety of the market, so did any of the sub-markets perform differently? You see Western North Carolina, this is kind of the beginning of its story. It had a drop, 3% in its total occupancy, and of course Tennessee Smokies run the highest occupancy across the entirety of the year, just under 60% for the whole. They were up 2%, Northwest North Carolina up 1%, but no real massive change. Break even for the market, but a little bit down for Western North Carolina in occupancy. Okay, average daily rate. That's just the nights that booked, take the average, right? And so the ADR, this is January through December, and this is for the whole Southern Appalachian Mountains. Sneak to the red box, 231 and 231, right? It just incredibly consistent. Can't get any more consistent than the exact same number. Down for March and April, just a hair. Obviously, March and April, in all of the beach markets we look at, I would encourage you to, if you're looking at whether you're behind, I hear a lot of people talking about pacing behind for March in our market, or making it up for April, and then it'll switch back and forth. It's those spring break markets change, Easter changes every time. So from a budgeting standpoint, I see an awful lot of people these days that are just looking at March and April as a whole, and you get a lot more consistency there, and you certainly see that when you look at the number. If we peg those two together, you see very little volatility across the 2 months. A little bit up for July 4th, and a little bit of a shift in Thanksgiving and a higher peak there, but overall break even for the year for ADR. So taking ADR down to the subregions, and this was really, the trend that we'll look at a little bit more, but it's the only market, Western North Carolina there, that's circled in red, that saw a real, drop in rates of any significance. Minus $16 for your Western North Carolina rates. Pretty even otherwise, dead even for the market as a whole, but Northwest North Carolina up $6. So pretty even rates. But something to worry about there with Western North Carolina, because you had a little bit of a drop in occupancy too, right? So even though your rates fell pretty significantly, less people responded. So need to figure out what's going on there. And then adjusted RevPAR. Okay, we've been talking about RevPAR in the space now really for the first time in the last 2 years, but it seems like every show we go to now somebody's talking about RevPAR. For those that might be new to the space, RevPAR is just that balance between pricing and occupancy, right? If you're priced at $100 and you fill up 50% of the nights, then that's the same as if you booked every night for $50. And so RevPAR just multiplies the two together and looks to see how you did at balancing that rate versus the occupancy, right? If you push your rates up, occupancy falls. If you drop your rates, occupancy goes up, just like with the sale of widgets. And RevPAR tells you how you're doing with respect to your overall ability to drive money. Adjusted RevPAR just uses adjusted occupancy in that formula. So it's just RevPAR with occupancy for owner nights and holds removed. So it's how well did I do at booking the nights I had times the rate that I was able to book it at. And if you look at adjusted RevPAR for the entirety of the market, red box again, down $1, right? 114 over 115. So again, really a consistent market. I told you I'd like to look for something exciting in the data. When you look at the market as an entirety, it's a very consistent year, 2019 versus 2018. We don't see a whole lot coming in 2020 that suggests that you can't use these last 2 years as a pretty predictable model for setting your rates and for setting your budgets. There's a few shifts I want to point out. But I would take comfort in the lack of anything exciting and bank on that consistency. You saw a little bit of shift there in March and April, but again, if you put those two together, it was consistent and a tad different in Thanksgiving.
Hey,
Does
Jason,
anyone have any questions about ADR,
I do.
RevPAR? Sarah?
Help me.
I just had a question about how does Key Data's market penetration play into this? So the shift from 18 to 19, because I can see seasonally how
sure.
it may not affect too much, but rates-wise, I'm wondering how that's accounted for.
Yeah, so great question. So if you look in our data, which a lot of you are looking at now, we've got some absolute values that are in the data, like number of guest nights in the market or number of cancellations. Obviously, as we bring on more and more of the property manager's data, those absolute numbers rise, right? We're going to see more guests in the market if we bring more data through. We're going to see more cancellations in the market if we bring more data through. But when we look at the pure percentages, so like percentage of cancellation or ADR or RevPAR, it balances out. Now, if we bring in a major new player that has a substantially lower ADR, that could bring the value down for the next year. And if we bring in a national player and they have half as much occupancy as the next player, then that'll obviously shift our overall data set. We try to look through that. We did have a player in this market that's new in the last 3 years that has a lot lower rates, and so we excluded them from this data set to try to account for that. But typically your percentage, your ADR, your occupancy, your RevPAR, now that we are kind of clipping at a consistent pace and we haven't had any really major changes in the supply in this area, level out.
Are there any other questions before we go? I have one for you, Sarah. As a revenue manager, if you're looking at flat year-over-year data over 2 years, what are you thinking you can do to move the needle at this point?
You're looking at demand, and you're looking where you can optimize and maximize revenue in other places. And that's where I think some of the, when you're talking about adjusting things and doing things on a more daily, if not, multiple times per day, you're really trying to take advantage of where you're seeing the demand. If it's not where you've typically seen it, where can you find that? Where can you make up for it somewhere else?
And in our market down at the beach, when we look at the macro data like this, every year it seems like our market raises their rates 10 or 15%, and they just do it. It seems like whether it's a good idea or it's not an idea, and they kind of stick it out there, and feels like we see them holding their collective breath, and then they wait to see what the market does in terms of response. And in some of the submarkets, it paid off last year in a really big way. We saw ADR go up 15, 20%, and occupancy keep up with it or almost keep up with it. So we saw some really significant jumps. And so I don't see in this data, kind of even looking back in the 3-4 year range, I don't see a real push for you guys to try those rates out maybe you are and you're pulling off the throttle a little bit easier. But it'd be interesting to see those of you who might be pushing rates a little bit more to see if the market responds to it.
And I think the other thing to consider too is that this is all aggregated. So in the end, it's all aggregated, a bunch of homes, right? Individual homes that have individual rate strategies. And so, that's the other thing is it's easy to talk about a market or whatnot, but the market is made up of individual homes that have, specific demand and whatnot for them. So I think that's the other thing to take into, this is a great starting point, but even you still have to manage the home.
Yeah, and if we threw all the PMs up here and separated them out, you'd see some that have much higher rates, much higher RevPAR, and you'd see some that have much lower. So the opportunity is definitely in there to outcompete your competitors with the right pricing. All right, RevPAR. Still looking at year-over-year change by the submarkets. Western North Carolina down $15. So
Hang tight, Jason.
Hey, Jason.
hey, Steve.
Hey, I'm just curious. I mean, I know that there's been a lot of news about both of it, but are you seeing any strains on your advanced booking data on coronavirus and the election year issues? Are you seeing anything that would suggest advanced bookings are starting to fall off?
Not as of this morning. I pulled it this morning because I was watching the coronavirus news and I looked at cancellations for this market and a couple of other markets, and I don't see any indication of it. I expect it. I did call our data team yesterday. I got a speech in San Antonio next week, and I said, please watch the cancellation numbers across the country and see if we see any spikes out west or wherever. In terms of cancellation percentages, as soon as we do see any of that, we'll get with Amy and report it and get it out to you guys. I know that's something, where our team's talking about, so watching for it, but haven't seen it yet, Steve. And I've got some slides coming up on 2020 real quick I'll jump to. So I think last one on 2019, this is the percentage change. It's the difference in this slide as opposed to the absolute change. And so the green is the ADR, the blue is the occupancy, and the orange is the RevPAR. And two things jump out at me of this slide. One is the occupancy is a bigger percent change than the ADR, so occupancy tends to be driving the RevPAR. But Western North Carolina, something to pay attention to. Definitely, down in the 15% range there for loss of ADR. And you can see the Florida Panhandle we stuck on there for comparison purposes. North Carolina coast also down in every respect. And then Northwest North Carolina up across the board. Mixed bag for the rest. Tennessee Smokies, I guessed, up just a little bit there. So I did pull up Western North Carolina just to see if there was any particular point in the year where there was a gain or loss for those of you in that market. And if you look, blue is 2019. This is the entirety of the year. And gray is 2018. And there wasn't a point in time where things, necessarily had an impact more so than the rest of the year. At the top is average daily rate, and it was just a hair down across the entirety of the year, like almost perfectly down. Like it looks like y'all just moved it down a couple of points and left it there for the year. The occupancy did not see a bump from the change in rates, and so if you look at RevPAR, it's pretty much consistently down across the whole year. So it feels like you just let off the throttle a little bit on the rates, and maybe wisely so, because you really didn't see a big gain in occupancy. But something to figure out for the market as a whole. What's causing that I guess that drop in RevPAR? Why are you able to adjust your rates down and not get a response in your occupancy? Quick peek at the feeder markets. You guys pull your guests from very different places. So if you look at some of these markets and view them as your competitive market, and you think about the guys next door as taking your clients, they may very well be taking clients that you have an opportunity to get, but if you look at the clients that they're actually taking, Tennessee Smokies, really spread out there, right? Couple of big cities that you pull from, but really all the way straight down the Mid-Atlantic. Western North Carolina, really a lot less diverse. Charlotte, in particular, standing out there just outside of this market, a little bit from Atlanta, but a lot more Florida and a little bit more of the East Coast, but not the Mid-Atlantic as much so as the Tennessee Smokies. And then North Georgia, just dominated by Atlanta, right? 6% of Atlanta, most dependent on a single metro area for sure, and then pulling from Tampa. But, really opportunities there for North Georgia to try to diversify in terms of where you're pulling your guests from, and try some creative marketing. And then Northwest North Carolina, again, 2 big cities dominated, Charlotte and Raleigh, and then more from, Florida, particularly Miami. But interesting to see how these markets are so close together and you pull from such different feeder markets, and to think about that from a competitive standpoint when you think
Hang
about
on one
your
second before you switch that screen.
On the prior slide before this, where you were talking about Western North Carolina down, I was just wondering, that was the only one that you said was more heavily driven by Airbnb, and do you think that could have an effect on what's going on in that area?
Yeah, great question. There's probably somebody in the room that can answer that better than me. I honestly don't know. I mean, that would be a place that I would look. Could that market do better if it was heavier on VRBO? I don't know. I'd love to be able to call up Airbnb and ask if there was a slide.
Well, I guess maybe more what I'm thinking is maybe it's a different type of property. It's not meaning Airbnb is pushing it necessarily, but that as Airbnb has maybe more smaller properties and it's coming on, it's driving those averages down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, more of the urban market push impacting the rest of the market.
And pricing too.
We do not. No, unfortunately, we don't have access to that data right now.
So this data is pulled from zip codes of guests?
It is, yep. Yeah, so we get the zip code of every guest coming to stay in from the PMs that share their data with us. That's exactly right. And we're about to release the reverse data so that you guys will be able to go in and say, not what percentage did I get from each of these markets, but I'm interested in Nashville. And so I want to see the reverse. I want to see where Nashville went. So if we got 2% of the Nashville market, who else got some of that Nashville market that's in that same, ADR range as we are? So you can know which markets to go after that have a similar pull from you.
Are there any other questions?
All right, 2020 pacing. Move to what's happening this year. More to Steve's question. So this slide, this is ADR back to the Southern Appalachian Mountains as a whole. And if you look up at the top right, it's up 3.5%. And what we're covering here is January to December. 2020 is in blue, 2019 is in orange, and 2019 final is in gray, right? So if you think about ADR when you're looking out in the future, right, you got your best prices out there right now, and people are booking at your best prices. And then as the year goes on, you start to come off that price, and as you book more last minute, your ADR falls. And so when you look at your ADR going forward, it's almost inevitably in every market going to end up lower at the end of the year, which you see for the gray line, than where it starts, right? Because you start doing discounting and last minute bookings, and obviously come off the price a little bit. But if you look at the consistency for 2020 and how it's shaping up, to Steve's question about the elections impacting it, is the coronavirus impacting it, for the market as a whole, you're up from 259 to 268. So no negative impacts. If they are there, they're not being seen in your rates. No areas of concern in terms of 2020 pacing for the market as a whole. So up 3.5%. This is occupancy. So are we seeing a drop in occupancy because we're getting away with a little bit higher rates? And the answer is no. Occupancy is up 17%. It's up from 11.6 to 13.6, particularly up in the summer. Okay, so if you're looking at the market as a whole, and again, reminder that these 4 submarkets do behave much differently, but the market as a whole looks like it's a really good summer so far. You see some differences going on there in March, April, and May. Again, I would encourage you to look at those on the whole as opposed to individually. They tend to spread out equally there. But the story here is 2020 looks good, and 2020 particularly looks good for the summer, and you're getting away with higher rates, and you might be able to get away with a little bit higher rates.
Sarah, if you were looking at this, what would you be thinking from a revenue management perspective?
I don't know yet. I'm letting it sink in. I think that's
sleep
good.
better.
March and April is a little concerning, right? But June and July, if I'm looking at, increased occupancy and I'm looking at my previous slide, I'm probably going to be thinking about some rate adjustments.
Right bump.
Yeah. I don't want to leave any money on the table, and it looks like there's plenty more opportunity there. So I probably would be looking at some rate adjustments up.
Probably sleep a little bit better too.
Absolutely.
This isn't what your slide looks like in Destin, is it?
No. To Amy's point, like, we saw some real interesting things. I won't bore you with them, but like in Destin, the 2-bedroom condos, the bottom just literally fell out, and everybody decided to go somewhere else because of the traffic and the changes that we've got going on there. So those changes tend to happen pretty quick, so keep an eye on your data, but overall, looks like a pretty good outlook for the market as a whole. So before you celebrate, you got to look at each submarket, and then to Sarah's point, you really got to look at your own data, because the submarket could be doing fantastic, and you could be doing something other. Or as every owner says, I really don't care how you're doing or how the submarket's doing. I just want to know how my house is doing, and so you got to kind of answer those questions as well. So let's look at what's happening. The top here, a lot of data on this slide. So just start at the top half. It's the average daily rate. The bottom half is the occupancy. So ADR by submarket. That's 2019 versus 2020 versus 2019 where it ended up, right? Your ADR is going to fall. So if you look at Western North Carolina, your ADR is continuing to come down for 2020, all right? Which is good for the rest of the market, because that means if the rest of the market's up and it's calculating in a $24 drop in Western North Carolina's ADR, then the rest of the market's doing even better, and you can see that across there. Florida Panhandle is up 10 overall, just for comparison. North Georgia Mountain's up $22, right? Pretty significant jump there. And then occupancy down at the bottom, nothing massive going on. We're down on the Florida Panhandle. I told you we like to press rates up and see how bad it hurts. And that's what you see again for 2020. They jacked the rates up $10 and it's starting to pull a little bit, but that's still a win in RevPAR, right? If you're up $10 and down 2%, I think it is. You got to look at the next slide. South Carolina coast over on the far right pushed rates up. No adjustment in occupancy, so that's a win. And then the market as a whole, obviously up a little bit for summer, but North Carolina is something definitely to check into. And then that's a repeat for the top 2 rows. The only new thing on this slide is the bottom, which is the adjusted RevPAR. That just calculates the top 2 to see what the hit is. So Tennessee Smokies up $8 for RevPAR. Northwest North Carolina up $6. Pretty even across the board for everybody else. But Western North Carolina's got a hit to their RevPAR. And it's rate driven, for sure. And that's looking at the next 90 days, okay? 6-month pacing, a couple of minutes here. 6 months pacing for Western North Carolina, just a little bit deeper dive to see what's happening and where it's happened. This is adjusted paid occupancy just for Western North Carolina. It's 2018, 2019, and 2020. I wanted to go back a year and see what the pattern looks like, okay? 2018, 15.7, 2019, 13.4, 2020, back up a little bit, okay? So nothing consistent there. Had a big drop in 2019 and then came back up a little bit. So you're down 10% since 18, but you're up for last year. And you see kind of the change there. It's particularly down in the latter part of the year. Okay, this is looking out 6 months. That's not the full year for those of you who can't see the bottom there. But you've got kind of May through August where you're considerably down compared to what you had in 2018. And then March, the same thing, right? A pretty good drop there in the March 21st and March 28 weeks for both of the last 2 years, also down in February. So 2018 was a much different year for you guys, something to dig into. This is ADR for that same market, for that same 6 months, and it's down 3 years in a row. It dropped from 362 to 325 to 310. So again, I'm not saying that the rate shouldn't be pulling off because the occupancy's, just hanging in there. It's not like you pulled off the rate substantially and occupancy shot through the roof. So it might be the right decision, and it might be that demand's overall down, and that's really where you got to look at. Or maybe it's a mix in the units that are pulling down the aggregate. And then adjusted RevPAR, right? The multiplication of the two, down 24% since 18. Pretty precipitous drop there. And it looks like it's consistent from February through August. So no point in time that's the particular concern. It's the entirety of the period there. All right, last couple of slides. 2020 pacing by summer. So we're just looking at summer here. Okay, Western North Carolina, the only market with the lower rates. Outer Banks is up 3. Of course, dominated by the summer markets, obviously. So we bring in the North Carolina and South Carolina coast there. South Carolina coast up 11 for ADR and even for occupancy, so winning there. North Carolina coast up on both, 19 for rates, so pushing rates pretty good and not getting a negative response in occupancy. So maybe room to even push rates further on the Outer Banks. Same with Florida Panhandle. Sorry, I'm going right to left there. Tennessee Smokies is an up on both. Western North Carolina, something to look at. And then up across the board, $32 up for Northwest Georgia Mountains, so good to see that. And then if you look at just the bottom of the slide, that's the new data there. That's just the RevPAR calc. So bottom line, summer season is looking good across the board. Amy asked me this morning if North Carolina coast was really looking good for the summer. They're up 23 for RevPAR, so the answer is definitely yes, looking better than all the rest of these markets, including the Florida Panhandle. Tennessee Smokies, second there with a plus 15. So overall, good news for the summer season. And that is it. That's an awful lot of data to start the morning with. I apologize.
So what we're going to do is Jason is actually doing a deeper dive into this data and some of these KPIs later in the afternoon. We're going to take a quick break. There are we put out some sodas and coffee and water and stuff like that right out front. Amber is doing a pretty important Google presentation here in this room. Steve Milo is doing a pretty candid strategic session next door in A. Leslie Adcock is going to be talking bed bugs right behind me in C. And then we're talking about smart home in Ballroom D. So again, thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy the day.
Thank y'all so much.